Picture this: June 3rd, 1945, just outside Manchester, England, where the air hangs thick with steam and the smell of industrial soap, and where a young woman named Lena Richtor is desperately trying to focus on the laundry in front of her, but her eyes keep drifting 15 feet away to where a British sergeant is showing a new guard how to adjust the water pressure valves. She's 22 years old, a former radio operator who served in France until her unit surrendered 3 months ago, and for 3 weeks now, she's been assigned to this laundry detail, and for 3 weeks, she's been trying unsuccessfully not to notice Sergeant Thomas Bennett. He's 26, with dark hair and a quiet manner, and there's something about his voice that does strange things to her concentration every time he speaks. Behind her, another prisoner named Katrina whispers in German, "You're staring again." And Lena jerks her attention back to the washing, insisting she's not staring. But Katrina sees right through her, pointing out that for 3 weeks now, Lena has been watching the sergeant with an attention she can't quite justify or explain. The thing is, Katrina isn't wrong. It started small, just noticing that Sergeant Bennett was different from the other guards. Quieter, more thoughtful, treating prisoners like people who happen to be on the wrong side of a war rather than enemies to be managed. Where other guards barked orders, he simply asked. Where others maintained rigid distance, he listened when prisoners spoke, actually listening rather than just waiting for them to finish. And then Lena started noticing other things, dangerous things, like the line of his jaw, the way his hands moved when he was explaining something, the particular timbre of his voice when he spoke quietly. This is the problem with being imprisoned for months. Small observations become magnified. Minor interactions take on disproportionate significance, and a guard who treats you with basic human decency can start occupying far too much of your mental space. When the work detail ends at 5 o'clock, the women file out of the laundry building toward the barracks, and Sergeant Bennett holds the door, standing aside to let them pass, saying in his careful German, "Good evening, ladies." His accent is terrible, but he tries, and that effort matters more than the grammar. Most of the women nod and continue past, but Lena finds herself slowing, meeting his eyes for just a moment. "Good evening, Sergeant," she says, and he switches to English, telling her that her language skills are improving, that she's been practicing. She mentions the library books, how she's been reading everything she can find. English grammar, English novels, anything to improve her vocabulary. "What are you reading now?" he asks. And when she tells him it's Great Expectations, she pauses, feeling bold, adding that it's fitting, perhaps, a story about expectations and reality being different. Something flickers in Bennett's expression, recognition maybe, understanding that she's talking about more than just a book. "I hope reality is proving better than expectations," he says quietly. And Lena responds that in some ways, yes. In others, it's more complicated. How do you explain to your captor that he's the complication? That his kindness and decency have created expectations you never anticipated? That propaganda promised monsters, but reality delivered someone far more difficult to categorize. "Complicated is honest," Bennett says with a slight smile. "Better than simple lies. Anyway." He holds her gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary, and then Katrina calls from the door, and the moment breaks. That evening in the barracks, the conversation inevitably turns to the guards, because the women have little else to discuss. And the monotony of camp life means that small observations become major topics. Someone mentions the new young corporal who looks about 17. Another adds that the Scottish guard with the impossible accent has a wife. And then Katrina looks meaningfully at Lena and asks, "What about Sergeant Bennett?" And several women laugh knowingly, because apparently Lena hasn't been as subtle as she thought. "What about him?" Lena says, trying for casual indifference and failing completely. And Frida joins in, pointing out that Lena has been watching him for weeks, and they've all noticed. And the question is whether he's noticed. There's nothing to notice, Lena insists. He's professional, I'm a prisoner, that's all there is. But Katrina says gently, except you wish there was more, don't you? And later, lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, Lena admits to herself that the honest answer is yes. Yes, she wishes things were different, wishes the circumstances were normal, wishes she'd met Thomas Bennett in a world where they weren't enemy and prisoner. But wishes don't change reality. And reality is that she's a German POW and he's a British sergeant, and nothing can happen between them. Even if, and this is the truly dangerous thought, even if he might feel something too. She thinks about that moment at the door, the way he looked at her, the carefully chosen words about reality being complicated. Was she reading too much into it? Seeing what she wanted to see because camp life was lonely and boring and he represented something different? Probably, almost certainly. But that doesn't stop her from replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every glance. This is absurd, she tells herself. She's 22 years old, a trained radio operator, an intelligent woman who should have better control over her emotions. Instead, she's lying in a prison barracks thinking about a British sergeant's rare smiles and the particular way he pronounces German words with his terrible accent. The next day brings an unexpected development when Lena is called to the camp commandant's office, and her stomach drops because being summoned to administration usually means trouble. Captain Morrison, the camp commandant, sits behind his desk with Sergeant Bennett standing nearby, and Lena's anxiety spikes. What has she done wrong? Has someone reported her inappropriate attention? Is Bennett here to formally complain? But Morrison begins explaining that Sergeant Bennett has made a recommendation, that they need a translator for administrative work, and Bennett believes Lena would be suitable for the role. Her English has improved significantly, and he suggested her specifically. The position would mean working in the admin building, different schedule, more interaction with staff, more responsibility, and also better rations and small wages. Are you interested? Morrison asks, and Lena thinks, is she interested? The position means escape from laundry monotony, means intellectual stimulation, and means, this is the dangerous part, working more closely with Sergeant Bennett, who apparently recommended her specifically. Yes, sir, she hears herself say. I'm very interested. After she's dismissed, Lena waits outside the building, her mind racing, and Bennett emerges a few minutes later, clearly expecting to find her there. You recommended me, she says in English. Not a question, but a statement. And he responds that she's qualified. Her English is excellent, she's intelligent and reliable. So why wouldn't he recommend her? Because, she struggles for words, because it means we'll be working together more. And that's complicated, he finishes, echoing her word from yesterday. They stand in the afternoon sun with careful distance between them, aware that other guards and prisoners move past. The power dynamic unchanged, the circumstances unaltered, but something unspoken passes between them anyway. I can request a different supervisor if you're uncomfortable, Bennett offers quietly, and Lena says no quickly, too quickly, and she sees his slight smile and realizes he knows. He knows she's been watching him, knows about the attraction she's been trying to hide, and he recommended her for this position anyway. The translation work proves challenging and engaging, with Lena sitting at a desk in a small office working through documents, letters, administrative paperwork, while Bennett supervises, helping when her English falters, explaining British military terminology, patient with her questions. They work in close proximity, professional and appropriate, and yet the attraction doesn't disappear. If anything, it intensifies. Working together means conversations, real conversations beyond guard-prisoner interactions. They discuss books. She learns he wanted to be a teacher before the war. He learns she'd planned to study linguistics. Small personal details accumulate. He takes his tea without sugar because wartime rationing made him used to it. She misses her grandmother's apple cake more than anything from home. He has a younger sister about Lena's age. She worries constantly about her brother, last seen fighting in Italy. These conversations happen in the margins of work. Brief exchanges while filing documents. Quiet words during tea breaks. Never inappropriate, always professional, but intimate in their own way. One afternoon in late June, they're alone in the office, and Bennett is showing Lena how to properly format a particular type of report. Standing close, not inappropriately, just close enough to point at the document on her desk. She's acutely aware of his proximity, can smell the soap he uses, can see the small scar on his left hand, can feel the warmth of him standing beside her chair. He's explaining something about comma usage, and she should be paying attention. But instead, she's thinking about how easy it would be to turn her head, to look up at him, to close that small distance. Lena, his voice brings her back, and she realizes he's finished explaining and is waiting for her response. "I'm sorry, I was..." She can't finish, can't admit where her thoughts went. "Distracted," he says quietly. Not a question, and she agrees, and he should step back. Should maintain professional distance, but instead, he stays where he is, looking down at her with an expression that makes her breath catch. "I should reassign you," he says. "This is becoming..." He stops, searching for words, and Lena whispers, "Complicated. Very complicated. Will you reassign me?" she asks, and after a long pause, he says, "No." "Why not?" And Bennett says carefully, "Because these conversations are the only thing that makes this war and this prison and all of this bearable, and I'm selfish enough not to give that up, even though I should." The honesty of it strikes her. He's admitting something dangerous, something that could get him in trouble, something that violates the guard-prisoner dynamic entirely. "I tried not to stare," Lena admits quietly. "In the laundry, at you. I tried very hard not to notice you. It didn't work." "I know," he says. "I noticed you noticing. And you still recommended me for this position." Like I said, selfish. They're crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. Both know it, neither stops. The summer passes, and the war ends officially in Europe. Japan surrenders in August, and the world begins the slow process of rebuilding. But POW camps don't empty overnight, because repatriation takes time, processing, documentation. Lena remains at the Manchester camp through summer and into autumn, still translating, still working with Bennett, and the attraction hasn't faded. If anything, it's deepened into something more complex. Not just physical attraction anymore, but genuine affection, understanding. The kind of connection that forms between people who've spent months in close proximity having honest conversations. But the barriers remain. She's still technically a prisoner. He's still her supervisor. The power dynamic makes anything more than professional friendship impossible, inappropriate, wrong. And yet, one October afternoon, Bennett brings news. "Your repatriation papers came through. You'll be processed next week, sent back to Germany." Lena knew this was coming, has known for months, but it still hits like a physical blow. "I see," she says, and Bennett starts, "I could..." then stops. "No, never mind." "What?" she asks, and he says it's not appropriate. But she presses him, and for the first time she uses his first name, Thomas. The intimacy of it makes him look at her sharply. "What were you going to say?" "I was going to ask if I could write to you after you're released, if I could stay in contact." "Is that allowed?" "Probably not." "Then we shouldn't." "No, we shouldn't." They look at each other across the small office. Months of unspoken feelings, months of careful professional distance, months of wanting something that circumstances made impossible laid bare between them. "I'll miss our conversations," Lena says quietly, and Bennett agrees. And it should end there, a professional goodbye, both moving on with their lives, former prisoner and former guard, nothing more. Instead, Bennett reaches across the desk and takes her hand, just for a moment, gentle pressure, then releases it and steps back. "Be safe," he says. "Build a good life. Find someone who—" He doesn't finish. "Who?" she asks. "Who can give you things I can't? Normal circumstances. No war between you, no prison walls." Lena leaves Manchester the following week, returns to Germany, to a devastated country trying to rebuild, finds work, survives, moves forward. But she doesn't forget Thomas Bennett. 3 years later, in 1948, a letter arrives at her address in Munich with a British postmark. And inside, in careful handwriting, Thomas writes that he hopes this letter finds her, hopes it's not unwelcome, that he told himself for 3 years he wouldn't write, that it was inappropriate, that they should both move on. But he hasn't moved on. He thinks about their conversations often, about the impossibly complicated situation they found themselves in, about how wrong the timing was. "The war is over now," he writes. "You're not a prisoner anymore. I'm no longer your supervisor. The circumstances that made things impossible have changed. If you're willing, I'd like to visit Munich. No expectations, no pressure. Just see if what we both felt was real, or just the product of circumstance. If you'd rather not, I understand completely." Lena reads the letter 3 times, her hands shaking, and the practical voice in her head says, "This is foolish, that 3 years have passed, that people change." But another voice remembers his kindness, his intelligence, his rare smiles, and she picks up her pen and writes back, "Your letter is not unwelcome. I've thought about you often over these 3 years. I'd like to find out. Come to Munich. No expectations, as you said. Just let's see." He arrives in November 1948, and they meet in a cafe in Munich's slowly rebuilding center. It's awkward at first, the echo of their former dynamics still present. But then they start talking, really talking, and Lena discovers something crucial. The connection wasn't just circumstance. "I tried not to stare," she admits, "back in the laundry," and Thomas smiles, saying he was very aware of her watching him. "Were you?" she asks, surprised, and he says, "Of course, because he was watching her too." They laugh at the strangeness of it. Former prisoner and former guard meeting to see if the impossible attraction was real. And when Thomas reaches across the table and takes her hand, not furtively this time, not something to be hidden, he says simply, "Yes, it's real." They marry in 1949 and build a life together, their children growing up bilingual, and when asked how their parents met, the story is both truthful and incomplete. During the war, in England, it's complicated. And it was complicated, but sometimes the most complicated connections are the ones that last. Lena never stopped staring at Thomas Bennett. Even 50 years later, she still caught herself watching him the same way. "You're staring again," he'd say, and she'd reply, "I tried not to. It never worked." "Good," he'd say. "Don't stop." Their story proved something important about human connection. That attraction doesn't follow rules. That connection doesn't care about sides. That sometimes the feelings we try hardest to resist are the most honest ones we have. Lena tried not to stare at the British sergeant who supervised her work detail in that POW camp outside Manchester in 1945. She failed completely, and that failure became the beginning of everything that mattered. A testament to the fact that love can bloom even in the most impossible circumstances, that humanity can transcend the artificial divisions created by war, and that sometimes the person you're not supposed to notice becomes the person you can't stop seeing. Not in 3 weeks, not in 3 years, not in 50 years. Because when a connection is real, truly real, it doesn't fade with time or distance or changed circumstances. It only grows stronger, more certain, more essential, until you can't remember a version of yourself that didn't include them, until their presence becomes as natural as breathing, until looking at them becomes not just a habit, but a necessity. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, even when the world divides itself into sides and enemies and prisoners and guards, the human heart remains stubbornly, beautifully, impossibly capable of finding its match across any divide, any barrier, any impossible circumstance. And that's what Lena and Thomas proved in that laundry room in Manchester, in that admin office during those long summer months of 1945, in that cafe in Munich 3 years later, and in every moment of the 50 years that followed. That some connections are simply meant to be, regardless of timing, regardless of circumstances, regardless of every logical reason they shouldn't work, because love, real love, the kind that starts with trying not to stare and ends with never wanting to stop, doesn't ask permission from history or war or appropriate boundaries. It simply happens, quietly, persistently, inevitably, until two people who should have remained strangers become the most important person in each other's world. And that's the real story here. Not just a love story from World War II, but a reminder that human connection remains the most powerful force we have. Stronger than war, stronger than time, stronger than all the reasons we tell ourselves something can't work. Because when Thomas Bennett held the door for those German prisoners on June 3, 1945, and Lena Richtor met his eyes for just a moment too long, neither of them knew they were beginning a story that would span continents and decades and prove that sometimes the most important decision we make is simply to stop trying not to stare, to stop resisting what we feel, to allow ourselves to see another person fully and completely, and to trust that if the connection is real, if it matters, if it's meant to be, then somehow, despite every obstacle, despite every impossibility, despite every reason it shouldn't work, it will find a way. Because that's what love does. It finds a way, always, inevitably, beautifully, and 50 years later, when Thomas would catch Lena still watching him with that same attention she'd tried so hard to hide in the laundry room, and he'd smile and tell her not to stop, they both understood what their story really meant. That the feelings we try hardest to resist are often the ones that matter most. That the connections we think are impossible are sometimes the ones that last forever, and that sometimes, just sometimes, failing to follow the rules, failing to maintain appropriate distance, failing to stop staring at someone you're not supposed to notice becomes not a failure at all, but the beginning of the most important success of your life. Because Lena tried not to stare and she failed, and that failure gave her everything.